For much of recorded history, Africa's kingdoms have been told not as a continuous story, but as scattered fragments, often described by outsiders, filtered through the perspective of empires that sought to define them rather than understand them. Yet, across millennia, magnificent African states rose, prospered, and sometimes fell, leaving behind legacies of art, governance, trade, and scholarship that shaped both the continent and the wider world. How did these kingdoms emerge across such diverse environments? From the green banks of the Nile to the open savannas of the Sahel, from the bustling Indian Ocean ports to the stone citadels of the southern highlands. What allowed them to thrive, and what brought them to moments of crisis? This is not a single story. It is a connected history stretching from the earliest farmers of the Sahara's greener age to the pharaohs and emperors of the Nile, the courtly cities of the medieval Sahel, and the maritime empires of the Swahili coast. It is a story of human ingenuity and of governance, trade, adaptation, and resilience, shaped by shifting climates, beliefs, and encounters with distant powers. Throughout this journey, we will witness how rulers forged alliances, commanded armies, and built complex economies while navigating upheavals, from internal rivalries to the arrival of new technologies and foreign influence. By following these kingdoms through time, we uncover not only their distinct identities, but also the enduring threads that unite them. From the dawn of kingship to the survival of royal traditions in the modern era, this is the grand narrative of Africa's kingdoms, told in their own rhythm, upon their own land. At the close of the last ice age, Africa looked very different. The Sahara, now an endless desert, was once a vast region of lakes, rivers, and grasslands. Seasonal rains nourished towering grasses where antelope, giraffes, and even hippos grazed freely. Archaeologists call this period the African humid phase, beginning around 10,000 years before the Common Era. Here, early human communities thrived as hunters, fishers, and gatherers, living in harmony with the changing land. As centuries passed, they began to experiment with new ways of living. They domesticated cattle, sheep, and goats, and planted crops in small gardens. Pottery fragments found in the central Sahara and along the Nile show that by 9000 BCE, people were using clay vessels to store grain and water. This was a quiet but revolutionary step. Food storage allowed communities to remain in one place longer, forming semi-permanent villages and expanding their social networks. But the climate was shifting. By 5000 BCE, the once green Sahara began to dry as the monsoon rains moved southward. The grasslands withered, giving way to the desert we know today. This environmental change forced migrations. People moved toward reliable sources of water, river valleys, lake shores, and coastal regions. Many journeyed east to the Nile, while others settled along the Sahel, that great semi-arid belt stretching below the desert. The Nile Valley was particularly fertile. Fed by the White Nile from the south and the Blue Nile from the Ethiopian highlands, its rich soil nurtured barley, wheat, and flax. And by the mid-4th millennium BCE, farming villages lined its banks, each with its own fields, livestock, and granaries. Life along the Nile required cooperation. The annual floods demanded coordination, measuring land, maintaining irrigation, and storing food for lean years. Leaders arose to manage these responsibilities, marking the first signs of organized authority beyond family and clan. In the Western Sahel, similar transformations unfolded. Communities adapted to drier conditions by mixing herding with seasonal farming. They moved their livestock with the rains while cultivating millet or sorghum when the land was fertile. The Sahel became a natural highway, connecting North Africa to the forests of the Guinea coast. Though still centuries away from the great trans-Saharan trade routes, These early movements of people and goods laid their foundation. Farther south, in what is now Nigeria and Cameroon, ancestors of the Nok culture were settling. By 2000 BCE, they cultivated yams, oil palms, and other native crops, part of what scholars call Africa's agricultural revolution. This revolution did not happen in one place, but across many independent domestications of plants and animals. In the Ethiopian highlands, farmers grew teff and enset. In the Sahel, millet and sorghum became staples. Along the Niger River, people began cultivating African rice. These advances reshaped society. More reliable food sources supported larger populations, and larger populations required more structured leadership. Kin-based clans ruled by elders slowly evolved into centralized systems with fortified villages and emerging hierarchies. Some leaders combined political and spiritual power, guiding both the body and the soul of their communities. These were the first seeds of African statehood. One of the earliest clear examples arose in Nubia, south of Egypt. Archaeological evidence shows organized polities here as early as the 5th millennium BCE. These communities traded incense, ivory, and skins along the Nile, linking north and south. Leadership likely centered on controlling trade routes and access to valuable goods. Technology accelerated these changes. By 4000 BCE, copperworking had begun in North Africa, and gold ornaments appeared in Nile burials. Metal tools improved. Agriculture, while metal weapons strengthened the power of chiefs and rulers. Even before formal states, shared belief systems bound communities together. Rock art from the humid Sahara depicts cattle herding, rituals, and dances, signs of collective identity and ceremony. Leaders likely held both temporal and spiritual authority, serving as intermediaries between their people and the divine. As the Sahara dried, waves of migration spread across the continent. Groups moved west toward the Atlantic, east toward the Nile, and south into the savannas and forests. This centuries-long dispersal spread farming, herding, and eventually metallurgy over vast lands. It also set the stage for the later Bantu migrations, which would shape the languages and cultures of sub-Saharan Africa. By the end of the 4th millennium BCE, several regions displayed the hallmarks of early statecraft: permanent settlements, surplus agriculture, specialized labor, long-distance trade, and centralized authority. Though not yet kingdoms, these societies laid the foundations upon which future empires would stand. Their mastery of land, adaptation to climate, and organization of labor created the infrastructure for power. These were the first steps toward Africa's great civilizations. With these roots established, our story now turns to the Nile Valley, where, in the centuries that followed, the very idea of kingship itself would take form. In Lower Egypt, the fertile floodplains enriched by silt sustained growing populations. Managing this environment required cooperation far beyond the capacity of small communities. Out of this necessity, the first unified Egyptian state was born, a system of governance that would last in various forms for more than 3,000 years. Before unification, Egypt was divided into two zones. In the north, Lower Egypt, at the Nile Delta, was a vast marshland fed by many branches of the river. In the south, Upper Egypt was a narrow valley bordered by desert cliffs. Both regions had distinct cultures and traditions, evident in pottery, burial styles, and artifacts. Excavations at sites like Nakada and Hierakonpolis reveal growing complexity, craft specialization, monumental architecture, and social hierarchy. As trade expanded and populations grew, rival chieftains competed for dominance. The leaders of Upper Egypt eventually prevailed, controlling routes to Nubia and securing prestige goods from afar. Then came the decisive unification under a ruler remembered as Nama, around 3100 BCE. The Nama palette, a ceremonial stone carved with vivid imagery, depicts the conquest. On one side, Nama wears the white crown of Upper Egypt, striking down an enemy. On the other, he dons the red crown of Lower Egypt, surveying defeated foes. Though stylized propaganda, it captures a deeper truth. The first Egyptian kingship was forged through conquest, sustained by administration. Once unified, Egypt built a powerful bureaucracy. Land was surveyed and taxed. Grain was stored in state granaries. Labor was conscripted for construction and irrigation. Officials from elite families loyal to the crown managed this machinery of state. Scribes recorded orders using hieroglyphs. An early writing system evolved from symbolic markings. Some of the first known inscriptions from this era are carved on ivory, pottery, and stone. The king was not merely a ruler but a divine embodiment of order, the living Horus, the son of the sun god Ra. This sacred kingship bound political power to cosmic balance. The king's duty was to maintain truth, justice, and harmony. His decrees carried both moral and administrative weight. This belief shaped Egyptian governance for millennia. Thus began Egypt's early dynastic period, roughly from 3100 to 2600 BCE, an age when royal authority was consolidated and the concept of kingship became the foundation of one of the world's most enduring civilizations. Capitals rose in powerful centers such as Memphis, strategically located at the meeting point of Upper and Lower Egypt. From this vantage, Egypt's rulers could oversee the fertile heartlands of agriculture and the vital trade routes reaching distant lands. The early kings organized expeditions far beyond their borders, to the Sinai for copper, to Lebanon for cedar wood, to Nubia for gold, and to the Red Sea for rare and exotic goods. Monumental architecture became the visible mark of this new civilization. Though the Great Pyramids were yet to come, Egypt's first kings built imposing tombs called mastabas, massive rectangular structures of mud brick and stone that reflected the belief in an eternal afterlife where the king continued to rule. The vast effort required to construct them, stone cutting, transportation, feeding and housing laborers, revealed the growing power of a state capable of organizing and sustaining large-scale projects. The Old Kingdom, beginning around 2600 BCE, marked the next stage in the evolution of divine kingship. The rulers of the Fourth Dynasty, Khufu, Khafra, and Menkaure, commissioned the legendary pyramids at Giza. These immense monuments were not only royal tombs but also political symbols, visible across the desert, proclaiming divine authority and eternal order. Contrary to popular belief, they were not built by slaves but by skilled laborers and farmers serving through corvée labor, working for the state during the agricultural off-season. Housed and fed in purpose-built villages, the prosperity of the Old Kingdom depended on the Nile's steady floods and the precision of its bureaucracy. Abundant harvests enabled the sponsorship of artisans, priests, and scribes. The royal court flourished as a hub of administration and creativity. Sculptures, relief carvings, and inscriptions celebrated the king's achievements, presenting him as the divine guarantor of balance and harmony. Temples dedicated to the gods also expanded in size and wealth. The king's sacred duties required elaborate rituals and offerings, strengthening the link between divine and political power. Over time, however, this central authority began to weaken. Regional governors, known as nomarchs, gained influence in their provinces, passing their positions from father to son. Though loyal in name to the pharaoh, many governed their territories as near-independent rulers. Combined with several years of poor Nile floods in the 22nd century BCE, this decentralization eroded the strength of the central state. By around 2100 BCE, the Old Kingdom had fallen into what historians call the First Intermediate Period, a time when local dynasties competed for dominance across the land. Though later remembered as chaotic, it was also a period of regional creativity. where art and literature flourished outside royal control. It served as a reminder that while pharaonic kingship was powerful, it was not unshakable. Around 2000 BCE, stability returned with the rise of the Middle Kingdom, established by rulers from Thebes. Kings such as Mentuhotep II and Amenemhat III restored centralized rule, strengthened the bureaucracy, expanded irrigation systems, and reasserted control over Nubia. The image of kingship evolved during this age. The pharaoh remained divine, but he was also portrayed as a shepherd of his people, responsible for their protection and well-being. This was reflected in art, inscriptions, and literature that emphasized justice, wisdom, and compassion. Trade and diplomacy flourished. Egyptian merchants and envoys ventured north to the Levant, south to the mysterious land of Punt, likely in modern Eritrea or Somalia, and deep into Nubia. Fortresses were constructed along the Nile to defend these southern frontiers and regulate trade in gold, ivory, ebony, and animal skins. These networks connected Egypt more deeply to both Africa and the Near East, setting the stage for future cross-cultural exchanges that would shape the ancient world. The Middle Kingdom also became a golden age of literature. From didactic texts used by scribes to tales such as the story of Sinuhe, writers explored themes of exile, loyalty, and royal mercy. These works entertained but also reinforced Egypt's moral and social order. Education centered on writing and mathematics became a path to bureaucratic service, allowing talent, not just birth, to determine advancement. By the close of the Middle Kingdom, pharaonic authority was firmly institutionalized. The king stood as the pivot of both the political and spiritual universe, the living symbol of unity. Even when central control collapsed again during the Second Intermediate Period, the ideal of divine kingship endured. It was a concept so powerful that it would influence future African realms along the Nile, including the kingdoms of Nubia, whose rulers would one day claim Egypt's sacred legacy as their own. South of Egypt, along the sweeping curve of the Nile, lay a land abundant in gold, copper, and precious minerals, a region the Egyptians called Kush. This was Nubia, home to some of Africa's earliest and most enduring civilizations. Though linked to Egypt by the river, Nubia's geography gave it a distinct identity. Fertile floodplains bordered by deserts and crisscrossed by trade routes reaching deep into Central Africa. By the early 2nd millennium BCE, the first great Nubian kingdom arose around the city of Kerma, near the third cataract of the Nile. Archaeological discoveries reveal an advanced urban center with monumental mud brick buildings, planned neighborhoods, and vast cemeteries filled with rich grave goods. The treasures buried with Kerma's elite, gold jewelry, imported pottery, and finely crafted weapons, attest to a wealthy society deeply engaged in long-distance trade. Kerma's strength lay in its strategic position. It controlled the flow of goods between Egypt and Central Africa. From the south came gold, ivory, ebony, incense, and animal skins. From the north came linen, jewelry, and bronze tools. Caravans and riverboats carried these goods along established routes, and Kerma's rulers taxed and regulated the exchanges, building wealth through commerce rather than conquest. Relations between Egypt and Kerma shifted between cooperation and conflict. During Egypt's Middle Kingdom, trade prevailed, with Egyptian outposts monitoring the frontier. But as Egypt weakened in the Second Intermediate Period, Kerma grew more assertive. Evidence suggests that its rulers may have allied with the Hyksos, foreign dynasts who controlled northern Egypt, against Thebes in the south. When Theban kings reunited Egypt in the 17th century BCE, they turned their armies southward, viewing Kerma as both rival and resource. The new kingdom pharaohs launched campaigns into Nubia, conquering Kerma and incorporating it into their expanding empire. For centuries afterward, Nubia was governed by Egyptian officials. Temples rose in honor of Egyptian gods, hieroglyphs replaced native scripts, and the Nubian elite adopted Egyptian customs. Yet this was not cultural erasure. Local traditions persisted, especially in rural areas, and over time Nubians themselves rose within the Egyptian system, serving as soldiers, administrators, even royal advisors. By the end of the second millennium BCE, Egypt's power receded once more. As the new kingdom declined, Nubian leaders reclaimed their autonomy. Out of this resurgence emerged the kingdom of Napata, centered near the Fourth Cataract. Napata became both the political and spiritual capital of a revitalized Kushite state. Its kings saw themselves not only as heirs to Kerma's greatness, but as legitimate successors to the pharaohs of Egypt, guardians of a sacred legacy that would soon return to power under Nubian rule. This connection to Egypt was not a simple act of imitation. The rulers of Napata embraced Egyptian religious traditions, especially the worship of Amun, yet merged them with their own Nubian spiritual customs. The great temple of Amun at Jebel Barkal near Napata became a sacred center of pilgrimage, where priests held immense influence, legitimizing the authority of the Kushite kings. Art and architecture from this era reveal a striking fusion of styles. Pyramids built for royal burials, though smaller and steeper than Egypt's, stood beside distinctly Nubian designs and motifs. Napata's power expanded northward, and in the 8th century before the Common Era, the Kushite kings seized upon Egypt's political instability to intervene. Under King Pi, they launched a campaign that united all of Egypt under Kushite control. Thus began Egypt's 25th dynasty, known as the Kushite dynasty. For nearly a century, Kushite pharaohs ruled from the Nile Delta to the 6th Cataract, presenting themselves as restorers of Egypt's ancient faith and culture after what they described as a period of decline. The reign of Taharqa, one of the most celebrated Kushite rulers, was distinguished by grand construction projects throughout Egypt and Nubia. He restored temples, commissioned monumental inscriptions, and reinforced the authority of the Amun priesthood. Yet beyond their borders, the Kushite pharaohs faced mounting threats, most notably from the Assyrian Empire in the Near East. A series of fierce confrontations eventually forced the Kushites to withdraw from Egypt, retreating to their homeland in Nubia by the mid-7th century before the Common Era. This retreat, however, was not the end of their civilization. The kingdom's power gradually shifted southward to Meroe, located between the 5th and 6th Cataracts. Meroe's fertile lands benefited from more reliable rainfall than the arid north, and its position along trade routes leading into sub-Saharan Africa gave it a strategic advantage. Over time, Meroe evolved into a vibrant, independent center, less reliant on Egyptian customs and more deeply rooted in native Nubian culture. One of Meroe's most remarkable achievements was its mastery of ironworking. Archaeologists have uncovered vast mounds of slag, evidence of large-scale smelting and forging operations. This technological strength fueled both the economy and the military, providing weapons for armies and tools for farmers and craftsmen. Iron goods, along with gold, ivory, and other resources, became vital exports that linked Meroe to trade networks stretching across Africa and beyond. The emergence of the Meroitic script around the 3rd century before the Common Era marked another major step in cultural independence. Though inspired in part by Egyptian writing, this was a uniquely Nubian alphabetic system tailored to their own language. While not yet fully deciphered, Meroitic inscriptions found on monuments, temples, and pottery suggest that literacy extended beyond the elite class. Meroitic art and architecture combined Egyptian, Mediterranean, and African influences. Its pyramids, smaller yet more numerous than Egypt's, stood as royal tombs for centuries. The decorative patterns adorning these structures featured African wildlife, local gods, and scenes of daily life interwoven with Egyptian imagery. This synthesis reflected Meroe's position as a cultural crossroads where civilizations met and mingled. By the first centuries of the Common Era, Meroe encountered new challenges. Trade routes shifted as Roman Egypt sought direct access to African goods via the Red Sea, bypassing Meroe's inland paths. Internal pressures, possibly resource depletion or political division, may have further weakened the state. By the 4th century, Meroe's dominance had ended, likely due to incursions from the rising kingdom of Aksum in the Ethiopian highlands. Still, the legacy of Kerma, Napata, and Meroe endured. These kingdoms proved that powerful, organized states could flourish along the Nile, independent of Egypt's shadow. They adapted to shifting climates and politics, maintained vast trade networks, and built their own cultural identity. Their story reminds us that the history of the Nile Valley belongs not only to the pharaohs of Egypt, but also to the African kings who forged their destiny beside them. The 8th century before the Common Era marked a dramatic reversal in the balance of power between Nubia and Egypt. For centuries, Egyptian armies had invaded the south, imposing their rule, extracting tribute and dominating trade. Now, in an astonishing turn, it was the Kushite kings of Napata who marched north to conquer Egypt and claim its throne. This was no fleeting raid, but the founding of a dynasty that ruled a united Nile Valley from the delta to the southern cataracts, asserting African power at the heart of the ancient world. This reversal was born from Egypt's internal chaos. After the decline of the New Kingdom, Egypt fractured into competing states. By the 8th century, the delta was divided among rival princes, while Thebes and its powerful Amun priesthood acted as an independent authority. This disunity left Egypt vulnerable, and the Kushite kings were ready to act. King Kashta, whose reign began in the mid-8th century, made the first decisive move. Without grand battles or conquest, he extended his authority into Upper Egypt through diplomacy, religious legitimacy, and calculated alliances. He placed his daughter, Amenertis, as the god's wife of Amun in Thebes, a position of immense religious and political power. This was a brilliant strategy, embedding Kushite influence within Egypt's Sacred Heart. Kashta's successor, Piye, took the plan even further. Around 725 BCE, he launched a military campaign that brought the entire land of Egypt under Kushite control. His own account of this conquest survives on the victory stela, a monumental inscription blending fact with royal propaganda. Piye described his journey north from Napata, uniting cities, defeating rivals in the delta, and restoring order. He claimed his mission was not conquest for its own sake, but the restoration of proper worship of Amun, neglected under Egypt's divided rulers. After victory, Piye returned to Napata rather than remain in Egypt. Napata was the sacred core of Kushite power, and from there he ruled Egypt through loyal officials and governors. Thus began Egypt's 25th dynasty, an era when African kings ruled both Nubia and Egypt as one realm. The Kushite pharaohs adopted Egypt's royal regalia, language, and titles, presenting themselves as true heirs to the pharaonic line. Yet they proudly retained their Nubian identity. Their art depicted kings with distinctly African features, wearing both Egyptian and Kushite attire. Temple reliefs portrayed them honoring Egyptian gods alongside their own Nubian deities, a confident declaration of cultural duality. Under Piye's successors, Shaka, Shibitku, and the Great Taharka, the dynasty embarked on ambitious restoration projects. Temples were rebuilt and expanded from Karnak and Thebes to the Nile Delta, while sacred sites in Nubia, such as Jebel Barkal, were glorified anew. Taharka's reign, in particular, was a time of wealth, diplomacy, and grandeur. Biblical records even mention him as a key figure in the politics of the Levant, where Egypt and Kush joined to resist the rising Assyrian Empire. But the Assyrians were unlike any force the region had faced. Ruthless, organized, and determined. Their conquests across Mesopotamia and the Levant eventually brought them into conflict with Kushite-controlled Egypt. Taharka allied with local states to resist them, But the Assyrians advanced relentlessly. In the early 7th century, their armies invaded Egypt, capturing Memphis and forcing Shaka to retreat south. Though he tried to reclaim the north, the Assyrians struck again, installing their own puppet rulers in the delta. His successor, Tantamani, briefly reconquered northern Egypt but was ultimately driven back once more. By 656 BCE, Kushite rule in Egypt came to an end. The dynasty withdrew to Napata, where it continued to govern a thriving Nubian kingdom. Far from being diminished, the Kushite rulers' prestige grew. They had once ruled the lands of the pharaohs and stood as equals among the greatest powers of their age. Their monuments still rose proudly along the Nile, and their devotion to Amun had bound the spiritual life of Egypt and Nubia together forever. The Kushite era transformed the flow of influence between Egypt and Nubia. For centuries, Egypt had shaped Nubia through conquest and culture. But under the 25th dynasty, Nubia reshaped Egypt, reviving its traditions, restoring its faith, and proving that African kings could command the world's respect. This episode challenges long-held assumptions about the direction of cultural exchange in the ancient world. It was not merely a one-way current flowing from the so-called civilized north to the distant south. The Kushite pharaohs proved that Africa's interior was fully capable of producing powerful, organized states that could project influence outward, reshaping one of the world's oldest civilizations in their own image. Even after the Assyrians withdrew and Egypt came under new native dynasties, Kush endured as a mighty kingdom. Over time, the Napatan rulers shifted their capital further south to Meroe, marking a new era in Nubian history characterized by advanced iron production, flourishing trade with the African interior, and a distinct cultural identity. The memory of the era when Nubian kings ruled as pharaohs lingered for centuries. In Egyptian chronicles, Nubian traditions, and the writings of foreign observers, the 25th dynasty stands as a rare moment. When the current of political power along the Nile flowed from south to north, a vivid reminder that the Nile Valley's story is one of shifting balances, rather than permanent hierarchies. While the Nile Valley witnessed the rise and fall of Egyptian and Nubian power, another great African civilization was emerging far to the west, along the sunlit shores of the Mediterranean. In the central coastal lands of what is now Tunisia, a city arose that would become one of the greatest maritime powers of antiquity, Carthage. From its harbors, influence radiated across seas and continents, shaping trade, warfare, and diplomacy for centuries to come. Surrounding Carthage, and deeply intertwined with its fate, were the Berber peoples of North Africa, whose kingdoms and confederations played decisive roles in the region's story. Carthage's beginnings lay within the broader movement of Phoenician expansion. The Phoenicians, master sailors and merchants of the eastern Mediterranean, hailed from the cities of Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos, located in what is now Lebanon. Renowned for their shipbuilding, navigation, and trading skill, they established colonies across the Mediterranean during the early first millennium before the Common Era. According to legend, Carthage was founded by settlers from Tyre in the late 9th century BCE. The ancient story, preserved by Greco-Roman writers, tells of Queen Dido, a Tyrian princess who fled political strife in her homeland and led her followers to the North African coast, where she established a new city. Though the tale may blend myth and history, archaeological evidence confirms that a Phoenician settlement existed at Carthage around this time. From the start, Carthage possessed key advantages. Its site offered a well-protected harbor, fertile hinterlands for agriculture, and a prime location along major maritime routes linking the eastern and western Mediterranean. The city rapidly evolved into a center of trade, dealing in silver from Iberia, tin from Britain, wine and olive oil from the central Mediterranean, and grain from North Africa. Carthaginian merchants also reached deep into the African interior, trading gold, ivory, and exotic goods through overland routes, controlled by Berber tribes. Politically, Carthage developed a unique system. Though originally a colony of Tyre, it soon became an independent state, governed by elected magistrates known as Sufet, a council of elders, and an assembly of citizens. This structure provided both stability and adaptability, allowing Carthage to respond swiftly to threats and opportunities alike. Its navy became legendary, not only defending trade routes, but projecting Carthaginian influence across the seas. The Berbers, known to the Greeks and Romans as Libyans or Numidians, were not a single nation, but a tapestry of tribes and kingdoms spread across the Maghreb. They lived as herders, farmers, and traders, and their cavalry was among the finest in the ancient world. Berber leaders alternated between alliance and rivalry with Carthage, providing horses, troops, and inland access to trade routes, while also competing for control of territory and wealth. As Carthage expanded, it came to dominate stretches of the North African coast and key Mediterranean islands, Sardinia, Corsica, and parts of Sicily. This growth inevitably drew it into conflict with another rising power, Rome. Their rivalry defined the ancient Mediterranean and would culminate in the three Punic Wars. The First Punic War, fought in the 3rd century BCE, centered on control of Sicily and was largely a naval struggle. Though Carthage possessed superior maritime experience, Rome's relentless innovation in shipbuilding and tactics turned the tide. Carthage lost the war, ceded Sicily, and paid a heavy indemnity, yet remained a wealthy and influential power. It was during the Second Punic War that Carthage produced its most brilliant commander, Hannibal Barca. Born into a distinguished family, Hannibal was trained in both Carthaginian and Berber military traditions. In 218 BCE, he launched one of the most daring campaigns in history, leading an army with war elephants across the Alps into Italy. His victories at battles such as Cannae displayed unmatched tactical genius, and for years he terrorized Rome's forces on their own soil. Yet despite his brilliance, he could not deliver a final defeat. Roman general Scipio Africanus later carried the war to North Africa, forcing Hannibal to defend his homeland at the Battle of Zama in 202 BCE, where Carthage was decisively defeated. Afterward, Carthage was stripped of its empire and military but remained economically vibrant. Its agricultural systems were among the most advanced of the ancient world, marked by irrigation, crop rotation, and large productive estates. These innovations restored its prosperity, though its revival provoked Roman fear and suspicion. The Third Punic War, fought in the mid-2nd century BCE, brought a tragic end. After a brutal 3-year siege, Rome breached Carthage's defenses in 146 BCE. The city was destroyed, its people enslaved, and its lands annexed as the Roman province of Africa. Yet, even in destruction, Carthage's legacy endured in its agricultural practices, trade routes, and the cultural bridges it built between Africa, Europe, and the Near East. Meanwhile, the Berber kingdoms to the west continued to rise. Numidia, under its great leader Massinissa, became a formidable state. Originally allied with Carthage, Massinissa switched sides during the Second Punic War, supporting Rome and gaining vast new territories in return. He unified the Berber tribes into a single kingdom, blending local traditions with Mediterranean models of governance. Numidian cavalry, famed for their agility and speed, became indispensable to Roman military campaigns. After Massinissa's death, Numidia fell into dynastic struggles and conflict with Rome. King Jugurtha's defiance in the late 2nd century BCE led to a long war that tested Roman power. Though eventually captured and executed, Jugurtha's resistance became a lasting symbol of North African courage and independence. Farther west lay Mauritania, encompassing parts of modern Morocco and western Algeria. Its rulers maintained a delicate balance between Carthage, Rome, and other Mediterranean powers, leveraging diplomacy and control of key trade routes to preserve autonomy. Mauritania would ultimately be absorbed by Rome. but only in the 1st century of the Common Era. The relationship between Carthage and the Berber states revealed a recurring pattern in African history: the interplay between coastal powers and inland kingdoms. Carthage's strength rested not only on its ships and merchants, but also on its ties to the Berber world. In turn, Berber rulers used their alliances with Carthage and later Rome to expand their own influence, sometimes as partners, sometimes as challengers. Far to the east, on the high plateaus of what is now Ethiopia and Eritrea, another African power began to rise at the dawn of the Common Era: the Kingdom of Aksum. Known to the ancient world simply as Aksum, it would become one of the great civilizations of late antiquity, commanding the trade of the Red Sea, minting its own coins, and creating a written language unique to its people. Aksum's influence reached across the African interior, the Arabian Peninsula, and as far as India's western ports. Its origins lay in the highland communities that had long practiced terrace farming, stone construction, and regional trade. By the 1st century CE, these communities had unified under a central authority based in the city of Aksum. Its inland position ensured protection, while its proximity to the port of Adulis allowed it to control maritime commerce. Through Adulis flowed ships from Egypt, the Levant, Arabia, and India, bringing silk, spices, wine, glass, and metals in exchange for African gold, ivory, frankincense, myrrh, animal hides, and other riches. This control over global trade routes brought Aksum immense wealth, and with wealth came power. The Aksumite kings expanded their domain through diplomacy and conquest, leaving inscriptions in the ancient Ge'ez script to record their victories. One ruler, King Gdrt, likely pronounced Gadarat, is mentioned in inscriptions in Yemen, evidence of Aksum's deep involvement in Arabian affairs. By the 3rd century CE, Aksum minted gold, silver, and bronze coins, bearing both Greek and Ge'ez inscriptions, a testament to its cosmopolitan character. These coins have been found from India to the Levant, showing the kingdom's integration into global commerce. Its decision to strike coins in multiple metals allowed trade across all social levels, from large-scale international exchanges to everyday transactions. Religion, too, held a central place in Aksumite life, evolving over centuries as the kingdom's power and connections grew, shaping one of the most enduring legacies in African and world history. In its early centuries, the Kingdom of Aksum practiced a polytheistic religion that blended local African beliefs with influences from South Arabia. Yet by the 4th century, the kingdom underwent a remarkable spiritual transformation. King Ezana, one of Aksum's most renowned rulers, converted to Christianity, making Aksum one of the earliest states in the world to officially adopt the faith. His conversion was shaped in part by contact with Christian communities of the Roman Empire, and possibly by missionaries from the Eastern Mediterranean. Ezana's embrace of Christianity brought sweeping changes. Crosses replaced earlier pagan emblems on Aksumite coins. Churches began to rise across the kingdom, and the Christian faith became inseparably linked with royal power and divine legitimacy. This new religious identity tied Aksum more closely to the Christian world, strengthening its connections with Byzantium and other Christian realms. Yet Aksumite rulers also displayed a degree of tolerance, maintaining peaceful relations and trade with Jewish and polytheistic partners across the Red Sea and beyond. Aksum's architecture reflected its ambition and grandeur. Its most iconic structures were the towering stele, massive obelisks carved from single blocks of granite. The tallest, known as the Great Stela, once stood over 30 meters high, decorated with carved windows and doors that mimicked royal palaces. These monuments marked the tombs of Aksumite kings, eternal symbols of divine power and masterful craftsmanship. The kingdom's prosperity rested upon several pillars: its control of Red Sea commerce, the agricultural bounty of its highlands, and its ability to project military influence across surrounding regions. But by the 6th century, Aksum faced new challenges. The rise of the Sasanian Persian Empire disrupted trade and shifted the balance of power along the Red Sea. When Persia's allies in southern Arabia threatened Christian communities, King Caleb of Aksum launched a bold military campaign across the sea, defeating the Himyarite ruler and establishing a client king loyal to Aksum. This victory briefly reaffirmed Aksum's dominance in the region, but it also stretched the kingdom's resources thin. In the early 7th century, the emergence of Islam reshaped the world around the Red Sea. During the Prophet Muhammad's lifetime, a small group of his followers fled persecution in Mecca and sought refuge in Aksum. The Aksumite ruler, known in Islamic tradition as the Negus, granted them asylum and protection until it was safe for them to return. This moment became an enduring symbol of compassion and early interfaith diplomacy between the Christian Aksumite state and the nascent Muslim community. Despite this goodwill, Aksum's economic position gradually weakened. The shifting of trade routes, possibly accelerated by the silting of the port of Verdulis, reduced its maritime significance. Environmental changes may have further strained the kingdom's agriculture. By the 8th century, Aksum's influence had faded, its political heartland receding from the Red Sea coast into the highlands. Yet its legacy endured. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church traces its origins to Ezana's conversion, and the ancient Ge'ez script remained central to religious and literary life. Aksum's architectural traditions and its fusion of Christian and royal authority continued to shape Ethiopian civilization for centuries to come. Aksum's story is a reminder that African civilizations were not isolated or peripheral. They were central participants in the great networks of trade, faith, and diplomacy that bound the ancient world together. For millennia, the Sahara Desert stood as one of Earth's most formidable barriers, dividing North Africa from the lands to its south. While Egyptians, Carthaginians, and Romans had occasionally explored its fringes, the immense dunes, searing heat, and scarcity of water made large-scale crossings nearly impossible. Early trade between the Mediterranean and the Sahel, a belt of grasslands just south of the desert, was limited to small-scale caravans or coastal exchanges. Everything changed with the arrival of the camel. Domesticated in Arabia centuries earlier, the single-humped dromedary proved perfectly suited to desert life. It could carry heavy loads, travel for days without water, and endure blistering heat. By the 3rd century of the Common Era, camels had reached North Africa, likely through Egypt or across the Red Sea. At first, they were rare curiosities, but Berber communities of the Sahara soon mastered their breeding and use. The camel became the key to a revolution in mobility and commerce, the foundation of the trans-Saharan trade network. Caravans could now journey vast distances between oases, opening routes that had once been unimaginable. Berber traders expanded their reach deep into the African interior. Oasis towns such as Ghadames in modern Libya and Tafilalt in Morocco flourished as hubs for rest, resupply, and exchange. These routes carried not only goods but ideas, technologies, and cultures. From the south came gold from the Niger Basin, salt from the ancient lake beds of the Sahara, and cola nuts from the forest belt. From the north flowed copper, textiles, glassware, and, increasingly, horses, animals that would transform warfare and political power in the Sahel. The camel's adoption allowed trade to bypass the Nile Valley and coastal routes, empowering inland states and communities to rise as major players in regional and intercontinental exchange. One of the most profound cultural consequences of this transformation was the spread of Islam. Beginning in the 7th century, the new faith expanded across North Africa and into the Sahel, carried by merchants, scholars, and travelers. Muslim traders brought not only goods but also literacy in Arabic, systems of law, and a shared spiritual identity that linked West Africa to the greater Islamic world. At first, Islam took root among merchants and elites in trading towns, but over generations, rulers and entire societies began to integrate Islamic beliefs with local traditions. The shared faith strengthened trade networks that now connected West Africa to Egypt, Arabia, and even India. Caravans from the Niger Bend could send gold to the Mediterranean, where it would circulate across the Islamic world. In return, textiles, metalwork, and knowledge flowed south. Yet trans-Saharan trade remained perilous. The desert was unforgiving, sandstorms, thirst, and bandit attacks were constant threats. To survive, traders traveled in large, organized caravans, sometimes numbering thousands of camels, led by skilled guides who knew every well and landmark across the dunes. Control of these routes became a source of immense wealth and power. Berber confederations taxed caravans or offered protection in exchange for tribute, gradually evolving into political entities that would later form states such as the Almoravid Empire. In the Sahel, the rise of trade fostered centralized kingdoms capable of managing production, defending routes, and negotiating with faraway powers. The introduction of horses, acquired through northern trade, gave rulers a decisive military edge, enabling them to project authority across vast territories. This blend of commerce, cavalry, and kingship became the foundation for the great empires of West Africa. Alongside trade and warfare came scholarship and faith. As Islam spread, mosques and Quranic schools appeared in Sahelian towns. Scholars traveled between North and West Africa, exchanging ideas that enriched both regions. Arabic literacy enabled the recording of local laws, histories, and poetry, ensuring that African voices joined the wider intellectual world of Islam. African scholars, in turn, made significant contributions to theology, law, and science that reached across the continent. Between the 3rd and 8th centuries, Africa underwent a profound transformation. The Sahara, once a forbidding divide, became a bridge uniting two worlds. At the center of this revolution stood the camel, a creature that reshaped economies, societies, and civilizations. The rise of trans-Saharan trade laid the groundwork for powerful empires whose prosperity would rest on their command of gold, salt, and the endless sea of sand between them. In the fertile lands between the Senegal and Niger rivers, one such kingdom began to rise, a model for all the great empires that would follow in West Africa's golden age. Known to its people as Ouagadougou and to Arab writers as Ghana, this ancient kingdom flourished through the power of trans-Saharan trade. By mastering the flow of goods between the gold-rich forests of the south and the salt-laden deserts of the north, Ghana rose as one of the most prosperous and influential empires of its age. The roots of Ouagadougou reach back centuries before Islam's arrival in West Africa. The Soninka people, who formed the heart of the kingdom, were skilled farmers, herders, and traders. They cultivated millet and sorghum, raised livestock, and engaged in local commerce long before their rise to empire. With the gradual introduction of iron tools and weapons, they increased both their agricultural productivity and their military strength. By the 7th century, certain Soninka clans had consolidated power, laying the foundation for a unified and centralized state. Ghana's geography was the key to its success. To the south were the rich gold fields of Bambouk and Bure, known for producing some of the purest gold in the medieval world. To the north lay the great salt mines of Tagaza and Taoudeni. In West Africa, salt was as valuable as gold, essential for preserving food and maintaining health in the hot climate. Ghana sat strategically between these two regions, controlling the trade routes that connected desert and savanna. By taxing and regulating this exchange, the kingdom grew immensely wealthy. The rulers of Ouagadougou established their capital at Kumbi Saleh, a twin city composed of two distinct quarters, one royal and one commercial. The royal section contained the king's palace, administrative offices, and housing for nobles and officials. The nearby merchant city was home to Muslim traders with mosques, markets, and warehouses. This dual city system revealed the kingdom's pragmatic approach to religion and governance. While the king and his people upheld traditional Soninka beliefs, they welcomed Muslim merchants. granting them the right to worship freely and conduct business under Islamic law. Arab historians such as al-Yaqubi in the 9th century and al-Bakri in the 11th described Ghana as a powerful and wealthy kingdom ruled by a magnificent king. His army, they wrote, was large and disciplined, featuring skilled archers and cavalry. The king's wealth was legendary, not only in gold, but in tribute paid by vassal chiefs in goods, livestock, and captives. Massive gold nuggets were reserved for the monarch himself, while gold dust served as the currency for trade among the people. Ghana's political structure balanced centralized authority with regional autonomy. Local chiefs retained control of their lands but owed allegiance and tribute to the king. This system allowed the empire to govern vast territories without constant military intervention. The royal court served as the supreme judge in disputes, and the king's authority was reinforced by military strength, religious prestige, and control over trade. As Ghana became increasingly connected to the Islamic world through trade, new influences arrived from the north. Muslim merchants brought fine textiles, copperware, books, and ideas in law, governance, and education. Some local elites converted to Islam to strengthen their diplomatic and commercial ties. Yet, the royal family largely remained faithful to indigenous beliefs, carefully balancing both traditions. This coexistence between Islam and traditional religion became one of Ghana's greatest strengths. It allowed the kingdom to profit from global commerce and Islamic scholarship without alienating its native population. Ghana thus became a cultural and economic bridge between Muslim North Africa and the non-Muslim societies of the Forest Zone. Ghana's golden age lasted from the 10th to the early 12th centuries. The wealth generated by gold trade was extraordinary. West African gold reached the markets of North Africa, the Middle East, and Europe, where it was turned into coins, jewelry, and treasures that financed armies and cathedrals alike. The prosperity of Ghana fueled urban development, craftsmanship, and artistic production in metalwork, textiles, and leather goods. However, Ghana's supremacy began to wane in the 12th century. Trade routes gradually shifted eastward toward new centers along the Niger River. At the same time, the Almoravids, a militant Berber reform movement from the western Sahara and Morocco, expanded southward. In the late 11th century, their campaigns sought both to control the lucrative gold trade and to spread Islam. While some medieval accounts claim the Almoravids conquered Ghana, archaeological evidence suggests a more complex decline caused by internal struggles, environmental changes, and evolving trade patterns. By the mid-12th century, Ghana had fragmented into smaller successor states. Some of its people migrated eastward, where they laid the foundations for a new empire, the Empire of Mali. Although Ghana's power faded, its legacy endured. It pioneered a model of governance based on trade rather than territorial conquest, setting the stage for the great West African empires that followed. Its success in balancing faiths, fostering commerce, and maintaining stability shaped the political and cultural landscape of the Sahel for centuries. As Ghana dissolved in the 12th century, the balance of power in the Western Sahel shifted dramatically. Over the next 100 years, new states emerged, vying for control of the gold fields and the trans-Saharan routes. Among them, one rose higher than all others, the Mali Empire. The rise of Mali began in the Mande-speaking regions along the upper Niger River, an area rich in fertile lands, forests, and iron resources. For generations, these communities had farmed, traded, and practiced ironworking. Yet, it was unity under a visionary leader that transformed them into an empire. According to the oral traditions preserved by West African griots, historians, poets, and musicians, this unification was achieved by a legendary figure named Sundiata Keita. His story, immortalized in the Epic of Sundiata, blends history and myth. Born into royalty but forced into exile as a child, Sundiata overcame adversity, disability, and betrayal to reclaim his homeland and liberate his people from the oppressive rule of the sorcerer king Sumaoro Kante of the Soso. The decisive Battle of Kirina, often dated to the early 13th century, marked the dawn of Mali's imperial era. Though wrapped in legend, the Epic of Sundiata reflects historical truth, the unification of the Mande clans into a centralized and powerful kingdom. Under Sundiata and his successors, Mali expanded rapidly. Control of the upper Niger basin gave it fertile farmlands and access to major trade arteries. The empire secured the routes connecting the gold fields of Bambouk and Bure to the markets of the Sahel and beyond. Mali's political structure combined strong central authority with local autonomy. Provincial governors, often from allied clans, ruled their own regions but paid tribute and provided soldiers to the emperor, known as the Mansa. Gold formed the bedrock of Mali's wealth. The empire controlled both the mines within its territory and the trade of gold from farther south. Salt, brought in huge slabs from the Sahara, was equally valuable. Copper from Takeda, cola nuts from the forest belt, and cotton textiles were other important commodities. Caravans laden with these goods passed through Mali's cities, taxed and protected under imperial authority. Peace and prosperity encouraged urban growth. Great cities like Timbuktu, Gao, and Djenné became vibrant centers of commerce, craftsmanship, and learning. Timbuktu, once a humble Tuareg camp, blossomed into a hub where merchants, scholars, and travelers from across Africa and the Mediterranean converged. Djenné, built on an island in the Niger Delta, became a gateway for goods moving between the savanna and forest regions. The most celebrated ruler of Mali was Mansa Musa, who ascended the throne in the early 14th century. A devout Muslim and astute leader, Mansa Musa became world famous for his extravagant pilgrimage to Mecca in 1324. His procession reportedly included thousands of soldiers, officials and servants, and camels loaded with vast amounts of gold. His generosity during the journey astonished the Islamic world, so much so that his lavish spending in Cairo allegedly caused a temporary drop in gold's value. But Mansa Musa's pilgrimage was more than a display of devotion or wealth. It was a calculated assertion of Mali's power and prestige on the global stage. During his travels, he forged diplomatic ties, attracted scholars, and invited architects and jurists to return with him. Upon his return, he initiated an ambitious program of construction, commissioning mosques, palaces, and learning centers in Timbuktu and Gao. Among the most famous of these is the Jingareba Mosque in Timbuktu. Designed by the Andalusian architect Abu Ishaq al-Swahili under Mansa Musa, Mali became not only the wealthiest empire in Africa, but also a beacon of Islamic learning and culture. Its influence stretched across continents, and its legacy as a center of faith, knowledge, and prosperity would endure long after his reign. Timbuktu, in particular, rose to fame as a beacon of knowledge and scholarship, attracting thousands of students and housing vast libraries filled with manuscripts. These manuscripts covered an astonishing range of subjects, from theology and law to mathematics, astronomy, and medicine. The city's scholars maintained active correspondence with intellectuals in North Africa, Egypt, and the Middle East, linking West Africa to the broader intellectual currents of the Islamic world. While Islam shaped the political and cultural life of Mali's ruling elite, the empire itself remained religiously diverse. Many rural communities continued to follow traditional spiritual practices, often blending them harmoniously with Islamic rituals. The Mansa, Mali's emperor, was expected to respect and mediate between these traditions, symbolizing unity across a vast and culturally varied empire. Mali's greatness rested on more than just its wealth in gold or its scholarly brilliance. It thrived because of its effective governance, organization, and infrastructure. The empire maintained a sophisticated administrative system, with appointed officials overseeing taxation, justice, and the upkeep of trade routes. A network of royal messengers ensured swift communication between the capital and distant provinces. The Niger River, running like a lifeline through the heart of Mali, became its greatest asset, facilitating the movement of merchants, goods, and armies. Despite its strengths, Mali began to face challenges in the late 14th century. The empire's vastness made it difficult to control far-flung territories, and ambitious provincial governors sometimes acted with increasing independence. Internal disputes over succession weakened central authority, while external threats loomed on every side. The Mossi kingdoms to the south launched daring raids into the Niger Valley, and in the northeast, the rising Songhai kingdom began to reassert itself around the city of Gao. By the early 15th century, Mali's supremacy was waning. The loss of key regions and the shifting of trade routes eroded its economic power. Yet Mali's legacy lived on long after its decline. The image of a golden empire, ruled by wise kings and filled with learning and prosperity, endured in the minds of both Africans and foreigners alike. European cartographers in the 15th century often illustrated maps of Africa with a crowned black king holding a gold nugget, an enduring symbol of Mansa Musa's legendary wealth and the glory of his realm. The Mali Empire remains a testament to the ability of African civilizations to harness vast resources, build thriving urban centers, and engage with the wider world through trade, diplomacy, and culture. Its blend of economic power, intellectual depth, and political adaptability became a model for the great Sahelian empires that followed. As Mali's influence faded in the early 15th century, the center of power in the western Sahel shifted once again, this time to the middle reaches of the Niger River. There, a state that had long existed in Mali's shadow began to rise to prominence. This was the Songhai Empire, whose heartland lay around the city of Gao. Over the next century and a half, Songhai would expand into the largest empire in West African history, dominating trade, scholarship, and politics across the Sahel and Savannah alike. Its rise would be as swift and powerful as its eventual fall. The origins of Songhai reach back centuries before its imperial greatness. Gao, the kingdom's earliest capital, had already been a bustling trade hub by the 8th century, strategically positioned along both trans-Saharan caravan routes and the navigable Niger River. For much of its early history, Songhai existed under the influence of larger powers, first Ghana, then Mali. But as Mali's power waned in the late 14th century, Songhai began to assert its independence. The turning point came with the reign of Sunni Ali, who ascended to power in 1464. A brilliant strategist and formidable warrior, Sunni Ali understood that mastery of the Niger River meant mastery of the Sahel. He built a powerful military force that combined cavalry, infantry, and a river navy equipped with archers, allowing his forces to strike swiftly across land and water alike. This fusion of mobility and power gave Songhai a unique strategic advantage over its rivals. One of Sunni Ali's most significant conquests was the capture of Timbuktu in 1468. Once a prosperous center of learning and trade under Mali, the city had fallen into instability under Tuareg control. Sunni Ali's forces brought Timbuktu firmly under Songhai rule, though his harsh treatment of its residents and scholars drew criticism from the city's Muslim elite. This tension reflected a broader divide between Sunni Ali's pragmatic, militarized approach to rule and the expectations of the religious class. Undeterred, he continued his campaigns, conquering Jenne after a long siege and securing another major center of trade. By the time of his death in 1492, Sunni Ali had turned Songhai from a regional kingdom into a mighty empire that rivaled Mali in size, wealth, and influence. Following his death, a struggle for succession erupted. Ultimately, power passed to one of his trusted generals, Muhammad Touré, who took the title Askia Muhammad. Under his reign, Songhai entered a new era of stability and reform. A devout Muslim and skilled administrator, Askia Muhammad sought to bring governance into closer alignment with Islamic law while maintaining respect for the empire's diverse cultures. He reorganized the state into provinces, each governed by an appointed official responsible for tax collection, justice, and order. A more formal system of tribute ensured steady revenue for the imperial treasury, and efficient administration strengthened central authority. Askia Muhammad also expanded Songhai's diplomatic and religious ties. In 1526, he embarked on a grand pilgrimage to Mecca, echoing Mansa Musa's journey a century earlier. He traveled with a lavish entourage symbolizing Songhai's wealth and piety. In Mecca, he met scholars and leaders, gaining recognition as a powerful Muslim ruler. Upon his return, he brought back jurists and teachers who helped standardize Islamic law and scholarship throughout the empire. Under his leadership, Songhai's economy flourished. Gold remained its cornerstone, but the empire also profited immensely from trade in salt, copper, kola nuts, and grain. The markets of Timbuktu, Gao, and Jenne thrived, attracting merchants from across Africa and beyond. Timbuktu once again became a beacon of learning, supported by imperial patronage. Its universities and madrasas, most notably Sankore, drew students from far and wide, and its libraries contained thousands of manuscripts on theology, medicine, law, mathematics, and history. Yet, the very size that made Songhai great also made it vulnerable. Communication across its vast territories was slow, and some governors grew increasingly autonomous. Maintaining loyalty required not just military might, but diplomacy and balance. Meanwhile, Songhai's wealth and prominence attracted the ambitions of foreign powers. By the late 16th century, Morocco, under Sultan Ahmad al-Mansur, sought to seize control of the trans-Saharan gold trade. Having recently triumphed over the Portuguese at the Battle of Alcácer Quibir in 1578, al-Mansur turned his attention southward. He assembled a professional army armed with firearms, arquebuses and cannons, technologies largely unknown in the Sahel. In 1591, a Moroccan force led by Judar Pasha, a Spanish-born Muslim commander, crossed the Sahara and met the Songhai army near Gao at the Battle of Tondibi. Though vastly outnumbered, the Moroccan superior weaponry devastated the Songhai cavalry. The empire suffered a crushing defeat. Gao, Timbuktu, and Jenne fell swiftly, and Songhai's centralized power crumbled. However, Moroccan control proved fleeting. The immense distance and logistical challenges made it nearly impossible to govern effectively. Songhai's former territories fractured into smaller states, and the once thriving trans-Saharan trade system splintered. Some successor states, such as the Dendi Kingdom, preserved fragments of Songhai's legacy, but the era of great centralized Sahelian empires had drawn to a close. The rise and fall of Songhai reveal both the immense potential and inherent fragility of the riverine empires of West Africa. Its rulers harnessed the strategic might of the Niger, fused trade and culture, and projected their power deep into both desert and forest. Yet, their dependence on traditional warfare left them exposed to new weapons and foreign ambition. Meanwhile, along the eastern coast of Africa, from modern-day southern Somalia to northern Mozambique, another network of flourishing city-states was emerging. Known collectively as the Swahili coast, these cities were dynamic centers of trade, culture, and diplomacy. Though politically independent, they shared a common language, Islamic faith, and mercantile spirit. Their prosperity was deeply tied to the Indian Ocean trade routes, which connected Africa to Arabia, Persia, India, and even China. The foundations of Swahili civilization lay in centuries of interaction between African coastal communities and foreign merchants. Archaeological evidence shows that as early as the first millennium CE, these settlements were trading iron tools, agricultural goods, and handcrafted items, laying the groundwork for one of the most vibrant maritime cultures in African history. As contact with traders from Arabia and Persia deepened, the East African coast absorbed new goods, architectural forms, and spiritual influences. By the 10th century, a distinctive Swahili civilization had taken shape, a seamless blend of African roots and foreign elements. The Swahili language, a Bantu tongue infused with Arabic, Persian, and later Portuguese words, emerged as the universal medium of trade and diplomacy. It linked coastal communities from Mogadishu in the north to Sofala in the south, enabling a shared identity that transcended local boundaries. These city-states often rose on islands, peninsulas, or natural harbors that offered both strategic defense and control over maritime access. Stone construction, inspired by Islamic models, became a visible sign of power and refinement. Coral limestone quarried from the reefs provided the raw material for mosques, palaces, and merchants' mansions. By the 13th century, cities such as Kilwa, Kisiwani, Mombasa, and Lamu dazzled travelers with their intricate stone architecture, a fusion of African artistry and Middle Eastern elegance. Islam became central to Swahili life, though it grew gradually through commerce and settlement rather than conquest. By the 11th century, many ruling families had embraced the faith, recognizing it not only as a spiritual path, but also as a key to integration into the vast commercial networks of the Indian Ocean. Mosques became focal points of civic life, and Islamic legal norms shaped trade, inheritance, and arbitration. The wealth of the Swahili coast rested on its role as the intermediary between Africa's interior and the world beyond the ocean. Gold from Great Zimbabwe, ivory from East African elephants, and enslaved captives from inland wars reached the coast to be exchanged for Persian ceramics, Indian cotton, Arabian coffee, and Chinese porcelain. These imported luxuries then filtered back inland, transforming lifestyles and material culture far from the shoreline. Among all the Swahili centers, Kilwa Kisiwani stood supreme. Situated off modern Tanzania, Kilwa commanded the southern gold routes from Sofala and linked directly to the riches of the Zimbabwe plateau. Its rulers commissioned grand structures like the Great Mosque of Kilwa and the Husuni Kubwa Palace, a complex of courtyards, storerooms, and ceremonial halls. The 14th century traveller Ibn Battuta marveled at Kilwa's beauty, cleanliness, and vibrant markets, calling it one of the finest cities he had ever seen. Each Swahili city-state functioned independently, governed by its own sultan or council of wealthy merchants. They cooperated in trade and defense, but also competed fiercely for dominance over routes and resources. Diplomacy was crucial, both among themselves and with foreign powers. Marriage alliances often sealed commercial partnerships between Swahili nobles and traders from Arabia or Persia, weaving together kinship and commerce. Their maritime world revolved around the predictable rhythm of the monsoon winds. Every season, ships called dhows with their triangular lateen sails crossed to Arabia, India, and beyond, carrying African gold and ivory and returning with spices, silks, and fine craftsmanship. This steady flow of goods sustained not just economies, but also a cosmopolitan exchange of ideas, fashions, and stories. Prosperity fostered a refined urban culture that prized eloquence, hospitality, and beauty. Homes of the wealthy featured ornate wooden doors carved with swirling geometric designs, and interiors were decorated with imported glassware and porcelain. Music, poetry, and storytelling flourished, blending Islamic devotion with local rhythm and imagery. But the wealth that brought glory also drew danger. By the late 15th century, Portuguese explorers sailed down the East African coast in search of a sea route to Asia. At first they sought trade, but soon their ambitions hardened into domination. Armed with cannons and heavily armed ships, they demanded tribute from coastal rulers and seized control of key ports. By the early 16th century, Kilwa and Mombasa had fallen under Portuguese occupation. Some cities, like Malindi, allied with them to gain advantage over rivals, while others resisted fiercely, leading to cycles of siege and destruction. Trade networks fractured and many city-states declined, though Swahili merchants continued trading, sometimes circumventing Portuguese posts. The balance of power had shifted. By the late 17th century, the rising Omani Arabs challenged Portuguese supremacy. Their naval campaigns gradually expelled the Europeans from much of the coast, integrating many Swahili towns into the Sultanate of Oman's maritime empire. This revived some trade routes and reinforced cultural and religious ties with Arabia, yet independence gave way to foreign oversight. Still, the Swahili city-states remain a symbol of Africa's maritime genius. Proudly African, yet profoundly global. They built prosperity not through vast conquests but through mastery of the sea, diplomacy and commerce. From their coral-built harbours, our path turns inland to southern Africa, where a different kind of power rose high above the plains. Here stood Great Zimbabwe, a monumental city of stone that spoke not of ships and sails, but of earth, cattle, and gold. Far from the ocean, in the highlands of southeastern Africa, Great Zimbabwe flourished between the 12th and 15th centuries. It served as the heart of a kingdom commanding key resources and inland trade routes. Its soaring granite walls and towers, built entirely without mortar, still stand as one of humanity's great architectural feats. Great Zimbabwe's origins lay in earlier farming and herding communities that had settled the plateau, cultivating millet and sorghum, raising cattle, and forging iron. Through trade, they linked the interior to the Swahili coast, exchanging goods and ideas. The plateau's fertile land, mild climate, and defensible hills encouraged population growth and political centralization. By the 12th century, Great Zimbabwe had emerged as a major urban and political center. At its summit rose the hill complex, a royal citadel of stone enclosures where the king and his closest followers lived. Below stretched the great enclosure, an immense elliptical wall more than 200 meters around and over 10 meters tall in places. Inside stood smaller courtyards and the mysterious conical tower, likely a symbol of royal power or ceremonial abundance. Beyond these monumental zones sprawled the valley ruins, the homes of the nobility and elite. The craftsmanship required to carve and fit granite blocks without mortar spoke to extraordinary skill and social organization. It revealed a state capable of mobilizing labor and resources on a massive scale, not for defense but to project prestige and order. Great Zimbabwe's wealth rested on control of gold, cattle, and ivory. Gold from nearby valleys traveled to Sahara on the coast, entering the Indian Ocean trade network dominated by the Swahili. From there, it journeyed to Arabia, India, and China. Artifacts found among the ruins, Chinese porcelain, Indian beads, Islamic coins, bear witness to this global reach. Cattle symbolize not only sustenance but also wealth and status, vital in trade and marriage alliances that linked powerful families. A ruler's authority depended on managing herds, overseeing trade, and maintaining harmony with ancestral spirits. By the late 15th century, environmental strain, soil exhaustion, and shifting trade routes began to undermine the city's prosperity. New gold fields farther north diverted commerce, and Great Zimbabwe's dominance faded. Yet its legacy endured through its successor, the Kingdom of Mutapa. According to tradition, it was founded by a prince from Great Zimbabwe who moved northward and established rule over vast lands extending into present-day Mozambique and Zambia. Mutapa inherited Zimbabwe's economic foundations, controlling gold and ivory routes to the coast while adapting to new realities, including the arrival of European powers. Thus, as one African empire waned, another rose, continuing the story of a continent whose wealth, artistry, and intellect shaped the world beyond its shores. By the 16th century, Portuguese traders had firmly established themselves along the Mozambican coast. Drawn by the lure of direct access to the gold-rich interior, they sought to bypass the Swahili intermediaries who had long controlled this trade network. Through diplomacy and coercion, they negotiated with the rulers of Mutapa, offering firearms, luxury goods, and promises of alliance. But the ambitions of the Portuguese extended far beyond trade. Their records from this era reveal repeated efforts to influence or even dominate Mutapa's internal politics, often by backing rival claimants to the throne. The relationship between Mutapa and the Portuguese was a tangled web of strategy and survival. At times, Mutapa's rulers skillfully used Portuguese presence to their advantage, playing them against coastal merchants or domestic rivals. At other times, foreign interference destabilized the kingdom, sparking civil conflict and weakening royal authority. The Portuguese also sought to Christianize the region, sending missionaries into the royal court, though their influence proved shallow and temporary. Despite these challenges, Mutapa endured as a powerful regional force through much of the 16th and 17th centuries. Its rulers continued to control the trade of gold, ivory, and other valuable goods, maintaining a system of governance deeply rooted in African traditions of kingship. Mutapa's decline in the late 17th century was the result of multiple converging forces: increased Portuguese meddling, the rise of competing states, and shifting trade patterns that undermined its economic base, all contributed to its downfall. Yet the legacy of Great Zimbabwe and Mutapa remains profound. These kingdoms proved that complex, centralized African states could flourish far from the sea, building their wealth through mastery of land, resources, and inland trade routes. Their monumental architecture, far-reaching trade connections, and intricate political systems shattered outdated notions that Africa's sophistication was confined to its coastal regions, in the forested heartlands and savannas of West Africa, far from the desert. Caravans and great river empires of the Sahel, two extraordinary centers of power and culture emerged: the Yoruba kingdoms and the Kingdom of Benin. Unlike sprawling empires such as Mali or Songhai, these were highly organized, urbanized states whose influence rested on refined governance, artistic genius, and in Oyo's case, remarkable military innovation. The Yoruba-speaking peoples shared a cultural and linguistic heritage, yet developed politically as a constellation of city-states, each ruled by its own leader, an Uni in Ife or an Alafin in Oyo. Among them, Ife held a sacred distinction as the spiritual heart of Yoruba civilization. By the 12th century, Ife had evolved into a thriving urban center, home to artisans, traders, and priests. Archaeological findings from Ife reveal an astonishing tradition of naturalistic art in terracotta, stone, and later, brass. The lifelike brass and copper sculptures unearthed there stunned early European observers with their realism and sophistication, so much so that many wrongly refused to believe they were of African origin. Today, these masterpieces are rightly recognized as evidence of a flourishing and deeply skilled artistic tradition. They represent royal figures and deities fusing political power with spiritual depth. The technical mastery of the lost wax casting method reflects centuries of metallurgical expertise and a society rich enough to sustain specialized craftsmanship. As a sacred capital, Ife was revered by many Yoruba states as the origin of kingship itself. According to legend, Oduduwa, the ancestral founder of the Yoruba people, established his throne in Ife, and all legitimate rulers derived their authority from him. This sacred prestige allowed Ife to remain a cultural nucleus even when it lacked direct political or military dominance. To the north, the Oyo kingdom rose in the 14th and 15th centuries, growing into the most formidable Yoruba state. Its strategic location straddled fertile forests and open grasslands, ideal terrain for cavalry warfare. While dense forests restricted horse use elsewhere, Oyo secured mounts through northern trade and trained a professional cavalry corps, giving it a decisive military edge. With this power, Oyo extended its reach over neighboring territories, controlling trade routes and demanding tribute. Oyo's political system was both centralized and balanced. The Alafin wielded supreme power but was restrained by the Oyo Mesi, a council of 7 senior chiefs who could compel him to abdicate if he failed his duties. This intricate system of mutual accountability, reinforced by tradition and ritual, preserved Oyo's stability through centuries of change. While Oyo and Ife shaped Yoruba civilization, another great power was rising to the southeast. The Kingdom of Benin, founded by Edo-speaking people, emerged in the 13th century under a line of rulers known as Obas. Its capital, Benin City, was a marvel of engineering and design, with broad avenues, vast courtyards, and complex systems of walls and moats stretching for miles beyond the city. These monumental earthworks were not only defenses but potent symbols of unity, power, and the Oba's divine authority. Benin's government revolved around the sacred monarchy of the Oba, supported by an elaborate hierarchy of chiefs and palace officials. Though decision-making was centralized in the royal court, provincial administration depended on loyal governors and tribute collectors who extended Benin's control over distant lands. Like Ife, Benin became renowned for its artistic excellence, especially in brass casting. The Benin bronzes, plaques and sculptures depicting royal ceremonies, warfare, and divine rituals decorated the palace walls. Each piece immortalized history and affirmed the sacred power of the Oba. Many were created to honor ancestors or commemorate major events, forming a lasting visual archive of the kingdom's story. Benin's prosperity also rested on trade. Situated near the Niger Delta, it enjoyed access to both inland markets and the Atlantic. By the late 15th century, Benin had opened diplomatic and commercial contact with Portugal, exchanging pepper, ivory, and later enslaved captives for European goods like textiles and firearms. Early relations were built on mutual respect and curiosity, with emissaries traveling between the two courts. But as the Atlantic slave trade expanded in the 16th and 17th centuries, the balance shifted. Although Benin participated in the trade, it imposed strict controls, at times limiting slave exports to protect internal stability and prioritize other forms of commerce. This selective engagement reflected Benin's political maturity and its determination to profit from global trade without surrendering sovereignty. Oyo, too, became entangled in Atlantic commerce during its later expansion in the 17th and 18th centuries. Its cavalry power allowed it to dominate weaker neighbors, supplying captives to coastal markets through intermediaries. This brought both riches and firearms, but also perpetual warfare and eventual instability. Despite their differences, Benin and the Yoruba kingdoms shared core traits. Both fostered complex urban life, balanced centralized monarchy with institutional checks, and elevated art into a language of power, memory, and identity. Both mastered long-distance trade, connecting interior Africa to global networks while maintaining deeply rooted local traditions. By the 18th century, however, cracks began to appear. Oyo faced internal rivalries, succession crises, and pressure from external enemies. Benin, though still magnificent, was increasingly drawn into the chaos of the Atlantic slave trade. Yet their legacies endured. The sculptures of Ife and Benin remain among the crowning achievements of world art. Their systems of government, blending monarchy, council, and ritual, stand as testaments to Africa's political sophistication before colonial intrusion. Farther south, across the forests and river valleys of Central Africa, new centers of power arose in the late medieval and early modern periods. Foremost among them were the Kingdom of Congo and its neighbors Ndongo and Matamba, located in what is now Angola and the Western Congo region. These states rose to prominence just as a new force began reshaping Africa's destiny, the arrival of European powers on the Atlantic coast. For the next 3 centuries, these kingdoms would confront, negotiate with, and resist Portuguese expansion, navigating the turbulent currents of the Atlantic slave trade. The Kingdom of Congo emerged in the late 14th century when smaller chiefdoms along the lower Congo River unified under a centralized authority. Its core region, Mbamba-Kasi, lay between the Congo and Kwango rivers, from which the kings of Congo, known as Manikongo, ruled a vast realm divided into 6 provinces and numerous tributary states. The capital, Mbanza-Congo, stood atop a fertile plateau with ready access to trade routes and river transport. By the early 15th century, Congo had become a dominant regional power. Its first encounter with the Portuguese in 1483 marked a turning point. When explorer Diogo Cao reached the Congo River's mouth, he established diplomatic ties with the Manikongo. This relationship deepened rapidly as Congo adopted aspects of Portuguese culture, technology, and religion. In 1491, King Nzinga Ainkuru was baptized as João I, initiating the Christianization of the Congo elite, a process that reached its height under his son, Afonso Band, who reigned from 1506 to 1543, would become one of Africa's most remarkable rulers. A devout Christian and a shrewd ruler, King Afonso I sought to blend European knowledge, religious devotion, and administrative innovation into the governance of the Congo Kingdom. He corresponded frequently with the Portuguese crown, asking for teachers, craftsmen, and missionaries to help strengthen his realm. Under his guidance, Mbanza Congo, renamed São Salvador, flourished into a city of stone churches, schools, and an educated elite fluent in both Congo and Portuguese. Yet Afonso's reign also exposed the dangers of deep engagement with European powers. The Portuguese were driven not merely by trade, but by the lure of enslaved labor to fuel their colonies in the Americas. Though Afonso initially sought to regulate the slave trade and forbid the unlawful capture of his people, Portuguese merchants and their African allies often ignored royal decrees, raiding villages and seizing captives. This growing exploitation strained the political fabric of Congo and destabilized neighboring regions as warfare and displacement escalated in response to the rising demand for slaves. South of Congo, the kingdom of Ndongo emerged as a formidable rival. Its rulers, called Ngolas, a title that gave modern Angola its name, governed lands along the Kwanza River. Ndongo's economy thrived on agriculture, tribute from subordinate chiefs, and trade in ivory, iron goods, and increasingly, enslaved people. As Portuguese expansion advanced into Angola in the late 16th century, conflict between Ndongo and European forces intensified. Portuguese settlers, soldiers, and their Imbangala mercenary allies launched repeated invasions to subjugate the kingdom and control its commerce. From this era of turmoil rose one of Africa's most extraordinary leaders, Queen Nzinga Mbande. Born into the Ndongo royal family in the late 16th century, Nzinga first gained renown as a skilled diplomat. In 1622, she led her people's delegation to negotiate with the Portuguese in Luanda, securing a treaty that recognized Ndongo's sovereignty and outlined mutual trade and military cooperation. Her intelligence and diplomacy quickly evolved into political mastery. After her brother's death, Nzinga ascended the throne, taking on the title of queen. Facing relentless Portuguese aggression, she adopted an agile and strategic approach, forming alliances with neighboring states, incorporating refugees and defectors into her ranks, and shifting her base of power when needed to avoid encirclement. After years of fierce resistance in Ndongo, Nzinga relocated her court to Matamba, a nearby kingdom she conquered and transformed into her new seat of power. Matamba's control over key trade routes enabled her to regulate commerce, amass resources, and sustain her campaign of resistance. Nzinga's leadership fused military prowess with tactical diplomacy and symbolic gestures. She embraced Christianity, taking the baptismal name Ana de Souza, yet continued to honor traditional African religious customs to unite her diverse followers. Through correspondence with the Portuguese crown and her recruitment of escaped slaves and deserters from Portuguese settlements, she skillfully turned her enemies' weaknesses to her advantage. Until her death in 1663, Queen Nzinga remained a towering figure of defiance, having secured Matamba's sovereignty and established a lasting legacy of resistance in Central Africa. The interactions between Congo, Ndongo, Matamba, and the Portuguese reflected the shifting tides of the Atlantic world. As sugar plantations expanded in Brazil and the Caribbean, the demand for enslaved labor became insatiable, pulling Central Africa into a vast commercial network that tied local warfare to European colonial economies. African rulers tried to control and profit from this trade, but the growing might of Portuguese naval and military power, combined with the chaos spread by Imbangala raiders, gradually eroded their autonomy. Still, these kingdoms were not passive victims of European encroachment. They negotiated, adapted, and resisted on their own terms, adopting firearms, forging dynamic alliances, and manipulating rivalries to preserve their sovereignty as long as possible. Christianity, introduced by missionaries, blended with local, spiritual traditions to form new religious expressions unique to the region. Art, music, and royal ceremony reflected this fusion, producing a vibrant and distinctive culture, even amid the violence of the Atlantic slave trade. By the close of the 17th century, the political landscape of Central Africa had been irrevocably altered. The once unified Congo kingdom had splintered into competing factions, many of which aligned themselves with either Portuguese or Dutch interests. Ndongo had been largely absorbed into Portuguese Angola, though resistance movements continued deep inland. Matamba, under Nzinga's successors, maintained its autonomy and remained a powerful participant in regional trade. The intertwined histories of these kingdoms reveal both the opportunities and the dangers of early global integration. While access to foreign goods, technologies, and alliances brought temporary strength, the unrelenting pressures of the slave trade and European militarization proved corrosive over time. Yet the rulers of Congo, Ndongo, and Matamba left behind enduring legacies of leadership, diplomacy, and cultural resilience, proof that even in the most turbulent centuries, African states navigated global change with vision and determination. From the forested valleys of Central Africa, our story now turns eastward to the highlands of the Horn, where the medieval Christian kingdoms of Ethiopia, first the Zagwe and later the restored Solomonic dynasty, confronted their own tests of faith, warfare, and transformation. Here, kingship was not tied to maritime trade or cavalry conquest, but to the preservation of a sacred Christian realm amid shifting alliances and religious frontiers. In the rugged Ethiopian highlands, a succession of Christian monarchies evolved, rooted in ancient heritage yet constantly adapting to the challenges of the age. Between the 12th and 17th centuries, Ethiopia experienced dynastic change, monumental construction, devastating wars, and sweeping cultural renewal. By the 12th century, the Aksumite Empire, once the region's dominant power, had long faded. Its cities declined, and its influence over coastal trade routes waned. Rising in its place were new Christian rulers from the highlands, most notably the Zagwe dynasty. Their origins remain partly mysterious, but they appear to have emerged from the Lasta region, shifting Ethiopia's political heartland southward. The Zagwe kings are best remembered for their astonishing church-building achievements. King Lalibela, who ruled in the late 12th or early 13th century, is credited with commissioning the remarkable complex of rock-hewn churches that still bears his name. Carved directly into volcanic stone, these 11 monolithic sanctuaries were interconnected by tunnels and courtyards, forming a sacred landscape meant to evoke Jerusalem itself. At a time when pilgrimage to the Holy Land was dangerous or impossible, Lalibela's creation offered Ethiopian Christians a divine alternative, solidifying both national faith and royal legitimacy. The Zagwe dynasty ruled for about 150 years before being overthrown by a rebellion led by Yekuno Amlak in the late 13th century. Amlak claimed descent from the biblical King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba, founding the Solomonic dynasty. This sacred lineage, enshrined in the Kebra Nagast, became the theological cornerstone of Ethiopian kingship for centuries. Under the Solomonic emperors, Ethiopia expanded its borders and reaffirmed itself as a Christian stronghold. The emperor, styled Nagusa Nagast or King of Kings, embodied both spiritual and temporal authority, commanding armies while protecting the faith. Though royal courts were mobile, the church remained the enduring backbone of governance, with monasteries and bishops serving as centers of learning, administration, and culture. Ethiopia was far from isolated. It maintained strong ties with the Coptic Church in Egypt, which provided its abbon or head bishop, and even dispatched envoys to European courts in search of allies against Muslim states along the Red Sea and in the Horn. To the east, powerful Muslim sultanates such as Ifat and Adal controlled vital trade routes. Relations with these states fluctuated between cooperation and open conflict. The most catastrophic of these clashes came in the early 16th century, when Ahmad ibn Ibrahim al-Ghazi, known to Ethiopian chronicles as Ahmad Gragn, the left-handed, launched a jihad against the Christian kingdom. Armed with Ottoman-supplied firearms, his forces swept through much of the highlands, burning churches and devastating the countryside. Ethiopia's survival hung by a thread until the arrival of a small but crucial Portuguese force under Cristóvão da Gama, son of the famed explorer Vasco da Gama. Their musketry turned the tide. In 1543, Ahmad Gran was killed, and the Christian kingdom gradually regained its lands, though it emerged exhausted and depopulated. Amid this recovery came the Oromo migrations from the south, vast movements of people that reshaped Ethiopia's social and political order. Organized under the Garda system of age-based governance, the Oromo expanded into highland territories weakened by war. Some integrated into existing societies, adopting Christianity or Islam. Others established their own dominions, permanently altering Ethiopia's ethnic and political map. Despite these upheavals, the Solomonic line endured. In the 17th century, Emperor Fasilides restored stability and founded a new capital at Gondar. This city blossomed into a center of art, religion, and administration, adorned with stone castles and richly painted churches that blended Ethiopian, Portuguese, and Ottoman influences. Gondar symbolized a renaissance of Ethiopian civilization, a union of resilience, creativity, and faith. By this time, the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church had become inseparable from the monarchy itself. Emperors supported monasteries, commissioned illuminated manuscripts, and guarded the faith against both Muslim rivals and intrusive Catholic missionaries, preserving the unique Christian identity that continues to define Ethiopia's cultural heritage to this day. The Jesuits, who arrived in Ethiopia in the early 17th century, seeking to bring the kingdom into communion with the Roman Catholic Church, initially won a number of converts, including Emperor Susenyos. However, their efforts sparked widespread resistance among the population, ultimately compelling Susenyos to abdicate in favor of his son, Fasilides, who expelled the Jesuits and reaffirmed the Ethiopian Orthodox Church as the state religion. By the end of the 17th century, Ethiopia had maintained its status as a powerful, though regionally contained kingdom. Its rulers had navigated dynastic transitions, foreign invasions, and demographic shifts, preserving a distinctive political and religious identity rooted in both ancient tradition and adaptation to new challenges. By the 18th century, much of the Sahel remained shaped by the legacies of earlier empires such as Mali and Songhai. Yet the political landscape had fractured into smaller kingdoms and city-states, many Muslim in name, but diverse in practice, blending Islamic traditions with older local customs. This pluralism became a focal point for reformers who sought to purify and renew Islam in the region. Their campaigns, often called jihads, brought sweeping political change, toppling old dynasties and establishing new orders across much of West Africa. The most influential of these movements began in Hausaland, a region of walled cities and fertile farmland in what is now northern Nigeria and southern Niger. States such as Gobir, Kano, Katsina, and Zaria were thriving commercial centers, linked to trans-Saharan and regional trade networks. They were also highly competitive, engaging in wars for dominance and relying heavily on tribute and slavery to sustain their economies. Islamic learning flourished in these urban centers, though religious practice often reflected a pragmatic blend of Islamic and indigenous traditions. Usman Dan Fodio, a Fulani scholar and preacher, emerged as the central figure of the reformist movement. Born in the mid-18th century in Gobir, he studied Islamic law, theology, and mysticism, earning renown for his eloquence and piety. He criticized the moral laxity and perceived corruption of Hausaland rulers, particularly their failure to enforce Sharia fully and their tolerance of non-Islamic customs. His call was not solely spiritual, it was deeply political, aiming to establish a state governed according to Islamic law. Tensions between Usman and the rulers of Gobir escalated, culminating in open conflict in the early 19th century when Gobir attempted to suppress his preaching and followers. In response, Usman declared jihad in 1804, rallying Fulani pastoralists, discontented townspeople, and allied Hausa groups. His forces secured a series of decisive victories, capturing major cities and replacing their rulers with loyal emirs. This marked the creation of the Sokoto Caliphate, a vast confederation stretching from present-day northern Cameroon to parts of Burkina Faso. At its height, Sokoto was the largest state in West Africa. Usman became the spiritual leader of the caliphate, delegating political authority to his brother Abdullahi in the west and his son Muhammad Bello in the east. This decentralized system allowed local governance under the oversight of the caliphate, with each emir responsible for enforcing Islamic law and maintaining order. Sokoto was part of a broader era of reform. To the west, Sekou Ahmadu launched a jihad that established the Messina Empire in the early 19th century. Based in the inland delta of the Niger, Messina was a theocracy emphasizing Islamic education, judicial reform and strict social regulation, integrating pastoralist and sedentary communities under a shared religious and political framework. Farther west in the region between the upper Senegal and Niger rivers, Al-Hajj Umar Tal led a jihad in the 1840s that established the Tukulur Empire. Umar Tal combined military expansion with religious reform, challenging traditional rulers and resisting French colonial encroachment. His campaigns brought him into conflict with Messina, which he eventually conquered at great human and material cost. These jihads reshaped the Sahelian political landscape. Ancient dynasties rooted in pre-Islamic authority were replaced or subordinated to leaders claiming legitimacy through religious scholarship and adherence to Sharia. The new states sought to standardize taxation, judicial systems, and education according to Islamic principles, though implementation varied regionally. Economically, these states relied heavily on agriculture, long-distance trade, and slavery. War captives were integrated into households, sold in regional markets, or sent across the Sahara. While slavery had long existed in West Africa, the jihads increased its scale, partly to reward followers and maintain large armies, leaving these states vulnerable to later European moral critique, even as European powers themselves exploited slave labor. The jihads also revitalized intellectual and cultural life. Centers of learning such as Sokoto, Timbuktu, and Jenne flourished, producing works on law, theology, history, and poetry. Usman Dan Fodio himself authored treatises outlining the responsibilities of rulers and the duties of Muslims in public life. His daughter, Nana Asma'u, became one of West Africa's most influential women scholars, promoting education and writing in Arabic, Fulfulde, and Hausa. Relations between these Islamic states and European powers remained limited at first, but intensified in the late 19th century as French and British colonial expansion reached the region. By the 1880s, Sokoto and the Tukulur Empire faced mounting pressure from European military expeditions and rival African states equipped with European weapons. Internal divisions, overextension, and foreign encroachment eventually undermined their independence. Yet, The religious and cultural legacies of the jihads endured, with networks of Islamic scholarship continuing to shape education and spiritual practice well into the 20th century. In many regions, the authority of local emirs or religious leaders persisted, both under colonial administration and in post-independence states. The jihads of the 18th and 19th centuries were not merely wars of conquest. They were movements of religious reform, social transformation, and state building. They demonstrated the Sahel's enduring ability to produce ideologically driven polities capable of mobilizing diverse populations under a shared vision. Meanwhile, in southern Africa during the early 19th century, the interior experienced dramatic political and demographic upheaval, later remembered as the Mfikane, meaning the crushing in Zulu, and the Difakani, meaning the scattering in Sotho. This period was not a single war or migration, but a chain of conflicts, forced displacements, and state-building efforts that reshaped the region from the eastern coastlands to the interior highlands. Out of this turbulence emerged powerful new kingdoms and visionary leaders whose political and military innovations left lasting marks on African history. The roots of the Mfikane lay in environmental pressures, competition for resources, and shifts in political organization. Late 18th century droughts strained agriculture and pastoral systems among Nguni-speaking communities in present-day KwaZulu-Natal. Meanwhile, participation in regional trade, particularly in ivory, hides, and cattle, meant that control over key resources offered significant economic advantage. Competition encouraged the consolidation of smaller chieftaincies into larger centralized polities capable of defending herds and projecting power. Into this context stepped Shaka Kona, the most famous leader of the era. Born into the Zulu clan, a relatively minor group within the larger Mthethwa Confederation, Shaka rose through the ranks as a warrior under Dingiswayo, the Mthethwa ruler. After his father's death, Shaka secured leadership of the Zulu with Dingiswayo's support, and upon Dingiswayo's death, he absorbed much of the confederation into his growing kingdom. Shaka revolutionized warfare in the region. He replaced the traditional throwing spear with the short stabbing spear, or ekulwa, designed for close combat. He reorganized the army into age-based regiments, or amabutho, who lived together in military homesteads and trained intensively year-round. Discipline was strict, mobility enhanced by barefoot training, and battlefield tactics relied on the horns of the buffalo formation. The central chest engaged the enemy head-on. The horns encircled them, and the loins remained in reserve. These strategies allowed rapid Zulu expansion during the 1820s, absorbing or dispersing neighboring groups. Some communities were incorporated into the Zulu system, contributing manpower and resources, while others fled, triggering a cascade of migrations across the region. Displaced leaders established new states, carrying Nguni military traditions into distant regions. One such leader was Mzilikazi, a former Shaka lieutenant, who moved into the highlands of present-day Mpumalanga and later western Zimbabwe, founding the Matabele Kingdom. Mzilikazi's polity combined Nguni military organization with local political customs, commanding respect and fear among neighboring peoples. In the south-central highlands, the upheaval of the Difakane allowed new forms of leadership to emerge. Moshoshu, a Sotho chief, skillfully united scattered communities under his authority. From his mountain fortress at Thaba Bosiu in present-day Lesotho, he offered protection to refugees, integrating them into his growing state. He balanced military defense with strategic alliances, negotiating with both African neighbors and European settlers to safeguard his people. Other groups, such as the Gazankulu under Soshangane, moved northward into present-day Mozambique, establishing a dominant state that controlled trade and warfare along the lower Zambezi. The Ngoni, descendants of those fleeing the Zulu expansion, migrated even farther, settling in modern Malawi, Tanzania, and Zambia. In each case, migrants adapted to new lands, blending their traditions with those of local communities. The Mfecane and Diffakane were not solely the result of internal African dynamics. They were shaped by environmental, economic, and social pressures as well as by the ripple effects of broader regional transformations. Historians have observed that the expansion of European colonial settlements at the Cape, combined with disruptions to local economies through trade in firearms and other goods, placed additional pressures on southern African frontier zones. The growing demand for ivory and cattle in coastal markets encouraged raiding, while the uneven spread of firearms shifted the balance of power between communities. Although Europeans had only limited direct influence during the early stages of the Mfecane, broader economic and political transformations in southern Africa set the stage for the upheavals that followed. The human toll was immense. Warfare, famine, and displacement disrupted agricultural cycles and depopulated vast areas, while other regions became densely settled by incoming refugees. Oral traditions across southern Africa preserve memories of flight, hunger, and violence, but also of resilience, adaptation, and the founding of new communities. By the mid-19th century, the political map of southern Africa had been fundamentally redrawn. The Zulu kingdom under Shaka and his successors emerged as a major power along the southeastern coast, engaging in both conflict and diplomacy with British colonial forces at Port Natal, later known as Durban. The Ndebele under Mzilikazi had established themselves on the Zimbabwean plateau, controlling crucial trade routes between the interior and Portuguese ports in Mozambique. The Basotho kingdom under Moshoshu had coalesced into a unified, mountain-based state capable of resisting both African and European encroachment. The military and political systems forged in this era had lasting consequences. The regimental organization of the Zulu army, for instance, remained in use well into the late 19th century. The state-building strategies of leaders like Moshoshu provided models for African diplomacy in the face of colonial expansion, while the migrations triggered by the Mfecane and Diffakane spread new languages and cultural practices far beyond their original homelands, creating new identities and alliances extending as far north as Central Africa. Yet the same forces that enabled these kingdoms to rise would eventually draw them into direct confrontation with European imperial powers. By the 1870s and 1880s, British and Boer expansion from the south, alongside Portuguese ambitions from the east, thrust the southern African kingdoms into a new and perilous political arena. From the upheavals of the Mfecane and Diffakane, our story now moves into the late 19th century, when the European scramble for Africa reached its peak. In this final chapter, we explore how African kingdoms, whether in the Sahel, the Forest Belt, the Horn, or the Southern Highlands, confronted the pressures of colonization, mounted resistance, and in some cases adapted their monarchies to survive into the modern era. By the late 19th century, Africa's political landscape was undergoing a transformation more rapid and profound than ever before. For centuries, African kingdoms had risen, flourished, and declined due to internal dynamics and regional rivalries. Now the most immediate threat came from outside the continent. European powers, driven by industrial demands for raw materials and strategic advantage, embarked on a period of rapid colonization known as the Scramble for Africa. The Berlin Conference of 1884-1885 formalized the division of the continent among European states, often with scant regard for existing political boundaries. Kingdoms that had once been regional powers were suddenly confronted with foreign armies, new administrative systems, and an economic order designed to benefit distant European capitals. Some rulers chose armed resistance, others negotiated, and still others adapted to preserve a measure of authority within the colonial framework. In the Horn of Africa, Ethiopia under Emperor Menelik II achieved one of the era's most celebrated victories. Drawing on a long tradition of centralized monarchy and diplomacy, Menelik modernized and expanded his army, acquiring firearms and artillery from European suppliers. When Italian forces attempted to impose a protectorate through the disputed Treaty of Wuchale, Menelik rejected their altered version. In 1896, Ethiopian forces decisively defeated the Italians at the Battle of Adwa, securing independence and making Ethiopia a symbol of African resistance worldwide. In West Africa, the Asante Kingdom in present-day Ghana resisted colonial encroachment throughout the 19th century. A series of wars with the British aimed to defend sovereignty and control over trade routes culminated in the early 20th century during the War of the Golden Stool, when British officials sought to seize the sacred Golden Stool of the Asante nation. Queen Mother Ya Asantewa led an armed uprising in 1900. Although the British ultimately prevailed, her resistance cemented her legacy as a leader who stood firmly against imperial domination. Farther east, in the Sudanese Sahel, a modest state challenged Anglo-Egyptian authority. Muhammad Ahmad, proclaiming himself the Mahdi, rallied Sudanese forces in the 1880s to expel Egyptian and British control. His followers captured Khartoum in 1885, killed General Charles Gordon, and established a theocratic state. Though British forces reconquered Sudan by 1898, the revolt demonstrated the mobilizing power of religiously inspired resistance. In West Africa's interior, Samurai Touré, leader of the Wasulu Empire, resisted French expansion through both military campaigns and strategic retreats. From the 1880s onward, he built a disciplined army equipped with modern firearms, employing scorched earth tactics and relocating his base repeatedly to sustain resistance. Captured in 1898, his decade-long struggle remains one of the most sustained anti-colonial campaigns of the period. Southern Africa also witnessed fierce confrontations. The Zulu kingdom, which had expanded under Shaka, faced British invasion in 1879. Under King Cetshwayo, the Zulu inflicted a stunning defeat on British forces at the Battle of Isandlwana, one of the rare occasions when an African army decisively overcame a modern European force in open battle. However, British reinforcements eventually overwhelmed the kingdom, leading to its partition and the curtailment of royal authority. Not all African kingdoms resisted through warfare. Some pursued accommodation to preserve aspects of sovereignty within the new colonial order. In the Buganda kingdom, in present-day Uganda, the Kabaka and his chiefs negotiated treaties with the British, retaining limited local authority under the protectorate system. While this arrangement reduced Buganda's independence, it allowed the monarchy to endure and evolve as a cultural institution that survives today. Colonial rule fundamentally altered African kingship. Many rulers were deposed, exiled, or reduced to ceremonial figures, with real power transferred to colonial administrators. Others became intermediaries, mediating between their people and the colonial state. The economic basis of royal authority shifted as control over trade routes and production was supplanted by integration into colonial economies centered on cash crops and mineral exports. Despite these constraints, monarchies remained potent symbols of identity and continuity, bound to sacred traditions, genealogies, and cultural practices that could not be easily erased. Even when political power was lost, kingship served as a focal point for community cohesion and sometimes as a subtle form of resistance to colonial authority. The 20th century brought new opportunities and challenges as African nations gained independence from the 1950s onward. Some monarchies were abolished outright by republican governments seeking to centralize authority and break with the colonial past. In Ghana, for instance, the Asante monarchy lost formal political power but retained immense cultural influence. In other nations, such as Ethiopia, the monarchy remained central to national identity until political upheaval, with the 1974 revolution ending imperial rule. Elsewhere, monarchies adapted to constitutional frameworks. In Morocco, the king retained significant political and religious authority. In Lesotho and Eswatini, formerly Swaziland, kingship continues to play an active role in governance, though often contested within democratic reforms. In many regions, Traditional or cultural kingships endure without formal political power, serving as custodians of heritage, language, and community values. The legacies of African kingdoms are complex. Some, like the Zulu monarchy in South Africa, wield influence through cultural revival, public ceremonies, and participation in national politics. Others focus on preserving historical sites, oral traditions, and artistic achievements connecting the present to the pre-colonial past. Across the continent, the survival of royal institutions as political actors, cultural leaders, or symbolic figures attests to their deep roots in African social and historical life. The story of Africa's kingdoms, from their formation in response to environmental change and migration, through their peaks of wealth, power, and cultural achievement, to their encounters with global trade and colonial conquest, is a story of resilience, adaptation, and creativity. These polities were dynamic systems, constantly evolving to meet the challenges of their time. Even in the 21st century, the legacies of these kingdoms continue to shape African identities. Traditional rulers still bless marriages, mediate disputes, and preside over festivals. Their histories are taught in schools, celebrated in literature and music, and remembered in monuments both ancient and modern. The institutions they built, cities, legal systems, artistic traditions, and enduring political ideas remain part of Africa's living heritage. This concludes our journey through the continent's royal past, a panorama of diverse political systems, rich cultures, and intertwined destinies that defy a single narrative. From the stone walls of Great Zimbabwe to the coral palaces of the Swahili coast, from Shaka's regiments to the manuscripts of Timbuktu, Africa's kingdoms testify to the continent's long and complex history, a history that continues to inspire and shape its present.